So I'm one of Jodie's PhD students at Michigan State, as she mentioned earlier, looking at the faunal remains for my dissertation. So I'm going to start out kind of just recapping a little bit about what Jodie mentioned earlier. So since the early 1990s, Morton Village and associated Norris Farms 36 cemetery, located in the central Illinois River Valley, which I'm going to call CIRV from now on, have been used as a prime example of the impacts of warfare on Indigenous communities in the Midwest. So during the mitigation excavations in the 1980s, archaeologists from the Illinois State Museum at Dixon Mounds excavated a small portion of the Morton Village site and completely excavated the Norris Farms 36 cemetery in advance of the roadway construction. Analyses of the skeletal remains from the cemetery found that 19% of individuals interred there, including 42% of the adult population, died as a result of violence and conflict, while many other individuals appear to have suffered from disease and malnutrition. Analyses of floral and faunal remains from the village suggested that the occupants ate a restricted diet and may have struggled to fully utilize the ecologically rich landscape of Emiquon and the greater CIRV. Combined, this evidence was used to interpret this occupation as one characterized by frequent violence and fear, so much so that villagers were wary of leaving the village perimeter in order to access a greater amount and variety of food resources, leading to widespread food insecurity in the community. Over the last 3 decades, this interpretation has been referenced widely and has become influential in research regarding the relationship between violence, foodways, and food security. For example, recent research in the CIRV by VanDerwarker and Wilson have extended this argument to other sites in the region, while also offering a more detailed archaeological model for investigating the negative effects of violence on diet. In their research, examinations of faunal and floral remains from float samples have shown a shift in diet at local Mississippian sites after 1200 CE, corresponding with an apparent increase in violence and concerns for defensibility. They argue that these shifts in diet are the direct result of violence and uncertainty, which force people to alter their subsistence regimes. But is this interpretation applicable to life at Morton Village and in the greater CIRV? Over the last decade, recent excavations at Morton Village conducted by MSU and the Dixon Mounds Museum at Morton Village have begun to reveal a different story of the site. As you know, research is ongoing, and this evidence that we found suggests that Morton Village was a sprawling, short-lived community occupied simultaneously by local Mississippian and migrant Oneota populations from calibrated AD 1300 to 1400. During 10 years of excavation and remote sensing at the work, no evidence of a palisade or other fortifications have been detected. And further, ceramic, architectural, and mortuary evidence indicate that complex social negotiations between residents were ongoing. The existence of special use facilities and feasting deposits also indicate that community members were able to pursue a lively ritual and ceremonial life and were able to secure enough provisions to hold supra-family events. While those living at Morton Village were under threat, it appears that residents were able to pursue a full family and community life. And so as part of our continuing effort to reevaluate life at Morton Village, this paper seeks to examine new evidence for diet at the site and to explore alternative explanations for the faunal use patterns uncovered there. So for this research, we compared the faunal patterns at Morton Village against an archaeological model that has been applied previously to archaeological sites in the CIRV and was recently expanded by VanDerwarker and Wilson. In this model, food security is determined largely by what resources are used and their relationship to people's willingness to travel outside the safety of the village. If a community was under the threat of violence, people would be less willing to leave the confines of their homes and limiting the areas available for hunting, trapping, gathering, and fishing. Because of this, threatened communities rely more heavily on agriculture and garden hunting instead of longer distance hunting and gathering trips, leading to less wild plant food and the greater utilization of mammals and other species regularly attracted to agricultural fields. People would also be less likely to procure fish and other aquatic species as riverbanks and other aquatic environments were away from the village and increase the risk of exposure. If fishing did occur, it likely would have been focused on hidden backwater habitats and smaller streams, which provided more protection. Due to their more restricted access to the broader landscape, such behaviors would lead to a less diverse and a more limited dietary base, and also increase the risk of overusing certain food resources, leading to food insecurity. So in order to apply these models to reassess the presence of violence-related food insecurity at Morton Village, we examined faunal remains from a random sample of features and test units excavated from 2008 to 2017, following standard zooarchaeological methods. Analyses of the botanical remains mentioned earlier are not included in this study, but we're hoping to incorporate those results in the near future. To select a random sample of context, I used a random number generator. In total, 20% of excavated features and 15% of excavated test units were selected for analysis. Both features and test units were selected in order to include fauna from discrete features and midden contexts at the site. In each context, artifacts were recovered through the use of 1/4-inch screen mesh, and flotation samples were also processed for the features. Once the identification of faunal remains was completed, we examined species environmental data to determine what types of habitats were being used by residents of the site and to assess their ability to utilize the various resource zones surrounding Morton Village. To investigate the importance of garden hunting at the site, we compared the faunal data from Morton Village to a list of regional species that prefer disturbed habitats and are commonly found in agricultural fields. As a proxy for hunting distance, we also examined the ratio of different skeletal portions among deer and wapiti remains in order to determine if the entire animal was being used or if only certain sections were being brought back to the site. Finally, we compare measures of diversity and evenness with other late pre-contact sites in the Midwest to determine if the faunal assemblage at Morton Village was unusually limited or not. In total, 19,525 individual faunal specimens were examined, with 13,646 of them identifiable to class or better. Of those identified to class or better, 53.7 were from mammals, 43.2 from fish, 1.9 were reptiles, mostly turtles, and just over 1% were from birds, shellfish, and amphibians. From these numbers, the Morton Village faunal assemblage seems to be dominated by mammals and fish, with mammals having a slightly higher representation. In general, these numbers match the results of analyses conducted by VanDerwarker and Wilson, which examined the number of identified specimens, NISP, by taxonomic class of fauna from flotation samples. And it may document a decrease in the percentage of fish specimens compared to earlier sites in their study. Our data are similar to those reported for the Meyer-Dixon site, a Larson phase Mississippian settlement from the VanDerwarker and Wilson study, which possessed a pattern that they argue indicates food insecurity. While this new data fits the trend seen in that study, it does not unequivocally point to a reduction in hunting trips and greater food insecurity. Morton Village is located in a very ecologically rich region, including upland and bottomland forests and forest edges, wet and dry prairies, marshes, swamps, various water sources such as backwater lakes, oxbows, smaller streams, and large rivers. Examinations of the preferred environments for this species found at Morton Village document that many of these areas were used to a greater or lesser extent. One of the main environments used by residents of Morton Village were forest and forest edges, home to species like white-tailed deer, wapiti, wild turkeys, and raccoons, which were some of the most abundant remains found at the site. They also heavily utilized the Illinois and the Spoon rivers and the smaller streams and backwater habitats that were nearby. These aquatic habitats provided access to a number of fish and mussel species, as well as beaver, muskrat, otter, turtles, and aquatic birds such as snow geese and Canada geese. In particular, fish, beaver, muskrat, and freshwater mussels appear to have been preferred prey species. Importantly, the types of aquatic habitats utilized at Morton Village varied widely. While residents readily used backwater habitats that may have kept them more hidden from possible attack, they also regularly utilized the main Illinois and Spoon River channels and other smaller rivers and streams nearby, which offered less protection. Though more limited, there's also evidence of the utilization of prairie species, such as prairie chickens and ornate box turtles, both of which prefer open grasslands. Overall, it appears that Morton villagers were using several different environmental zones surrounding them and were not limited in where they could hunt and fish. There's also little clear evidence for a greater reliance on garden hunting. When the species present at Morton Village are compared to a list of taxa that could be possibly garden hunted, there's some overlap, but in general, most of the species that overlap are represented by less than 5 individual specimens. Further, the minimum number of individuals, or MNI, for those species comprise only 13% of the overall MNI from the site, a small percentage of that overall assemblage. Only deer, raccoon, and turkey are represented by larger NASP and MNI, and these species would have been regularly available from the surrounding landscape as well. While deer is the most prevalent mammal represented in the Morton Village data, many of the other prevalent species in this sample in terms of NASP and MNI, such as wapiti, beaver, and muskrat, would not have been found very frequently near fields. Additionally, fish and mussels make up over 63% of the total faunal sample in terms of MNI, indicating that residents were regularly using other areas besides agricultural fields. Among the deer and wapiti remains, ratios of skeletal portions also indicate that leg and head elements dominate the assemblage. While not a perfect measure of hunting distance, this may indicate that most hunting occurred farther away from the village and only select parts of the deer and wapiti were brought back to the site. If garden hunting was occurring, it appears to have been selective, focusing primarily on deer and raccoon, which suggests that residents had enough meat and could be selective about what they hunted, instead of hunting and trapping everything that was available. Garden hunting by itself also does not point to food insecurity, as this was likely a strategy used by many agriculturalists around the world and not just those who are living in hostile social settings. To examine the diversity of species at Morton Village, data from the site was compared to published data from the Mississippian lamb and late woodland/Mississippian range sites in the CIRV, and the Loman and Sterling phase components of the range site in the American bottom, using 3 indices of diversity and evenness: dominance, Simpson 1D, and Shannon. In general, the diversity and evenness of the species at Morton Village is similar to those seen at the lamb and range sites, and is more diverse than the faunal patterns at Wrench. This indicates that the residents of Morton Village utilized a variety of species and did not suffer from a less diverse diet. Instead, they were able to utilize a similarly diverse number of species compared to other sites in the CIRV and nearby regions. In addition, there's no apparent increase in the use of secondary or tertiary faunal resources at Morton Village, such as rodents, small mammals and birds, and amphibians, suggesting that this diverse diet was not enacted in a way to compensate for a lack of access to desired species. Overall, there is little clear evidence for food insecurity at Morton Village. While evidence for violence is present at the site and in the region, the faunal evidence indicates that the residents of Morton Village were resilient and able to successfully access preferred prey species and supply themselves with adequate amount of meat. While garden hunting may have occurred, they do not appear to have been heavily reliant on it, but instead were able to move around Emiquon and the surrounding CIRV and use their rich and varied resources. Data and interpretations from Dr. Kelsey Nordine's recent dissertation on botanical remains from Morton Village also does not definitively support the circumscription model, but more comparative data is needed to better evaluate this argument. Her results indicate that Morton villagers had a similar plant focus to Magonia phase sites in Iowa, and that if circumscription did occur, it didn't differentially impact the migrants or locals at Morton Village. Furthermore, Bankston and O'Gorman note that there is osteological evidence that points to the assault of small work parties away from the village, indicating that residents were regularly leaving the safety of the village, either because the risk of violence was low or they chose to go despite the risk. To account for a possible shift in faunal use patterns in the CIRV after AD 1200, cultural, environmental, and demographic factors, among others, need to be considered alongside conflict to better understand why these changes occurred. Instead of a lack of food, the faunal patterns at Morton Village and other sites in the CIRV suggest that people living in the area increasingly chose to focus their subsistence on resources that were more difficult to overuse and provided more meat for the amount of effort, such as wapiti, deer, and fish. While more research is needed, this change in subsistence could have been a response to increased nucleation and a growing reliance on agriculture in the region post-AD 1200. Later impacts from migration may have required subsequent alterations to subsistence patterns as well. Alternatively, periods of violence in the region may have been irregular and relatively short, not constant, so signatures of food insecurity during those time periods may have been obscured by longer periods of successful hunting. In conclusion, this research demonstrates that more refined models and methods, including more detailed faunal profiles for intersite comparisons, are needed to confidently identify food insecurity in the past. And further, it indicates that it's crucial to decouple food insecurity from the presence of violence as indicators of violence, especially intermittent or short-term violence, does not mean that food insecurity will always be present or recognizable in habitation debris. Thank you.